Hi, welcome to our webinar on the potential impact of a Trump presidency on corporate compliance. My name is Naomi Grossman, Learning Content Manager here at VinciWorks. I focus on everything to do with helping companies figure out how they can manage compliance, including researching tools companies can use to help them in that effort. We're here today to discuss the potential impact of a Trump presidency on corporate compliance. So we're just 2 days out from the inauguration. I cannot think of a better time to do this. So we are covering a lot today, but there will be a recording coming after the webinar is over. You can also download our guide to our top 10 compliance challenges in 2025 and how to prepare for them. That link is coming up in the chat now. I highly recommend this guide. Really effective guide on how to deal with these compliance challenges that are coming up. The link is there in the chat. And we also really want to hear from you over the next hour. So please do keep writing in your questions and comments and what you're thinking about over the next year. And we'll read some of those out as we go through. And write compliance in the chat if you want to try any of our compliance courses. We have US compliance course suites. Let us know if you're interested specifically in trying those. Also, you can download our course catalog. That's coming up in the chat now. Really comprehensive catalog, covers all our courses. Like I said, we have some US courses that could be relevant for some of you who are on the webinar today. So last bit of housekeeping, this webinar is part of a series of webinars, taking a deeper dive into the compliance and regulatory outlook for the year ahead. So if you or a colleague would like to come to any of those webinars, or most of them are done, so if any of you want to get the links to those webinars, they're coming up in the chat now. I'll just quickly review what we did. On January 9th, we did an overview of all the main topics we think should be in your compliance agenda for the year ahead. On January 14th, we took a deep dive into health and safety compliance. On January 15th, we looked at everything AI, GDPR, and data protection coming up for the year ahead. On January 16th, and yes, we are all tired, we explored what's ahead for companies in managing AML, sanctions, and fraud. Also on January 16th, we discussed diversity and inclusion in 2025. We covered those issues that'll be most relevant for this year. Just yesterday, we held a webinar in German looking at key compliance issues across Europe and what compliance changes we can expect with the upcoming German election. So that's pretty relevant for right now. And of course, today we'll be exploring the compliance challenges and regulatory changes of the incoming Trump administration in Washington. Now, finally, to round out our January webinar series, we're hosting a really interesting special product-focused webinar on January 29th, that's a Wednesday, at the normal time of midday UK time. So if you ever wanted to know about the different ways VinciWorks can support your business through software, training, and consultancy, and how our different products are designed to help you, please do come along to that webinar. So we have links to all the webinars that were done and dates for the upcoming ones. Okay, that's out of the way. Let's get back to our webinar. Now, it's anticipated that the new conservative administration under President Trump will significantly reshape the regulatory environment for many companies, specifically in the areas of compliance. We only have to look to Trump's previous tenure, where his approach to governance often favored deregulation and reduced governmental oversight. But of course, this is President Trump we're talking about, so it's really hard to predict anything. So joining me today is Thomas Volk, head of marketing for VinciWorks Germany and a political columnist. Thomas, it's great to have you, and I know you would agree with that last statement.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me, Naomi. I'm really glad to be here today. If there was ever a topic that gets me going, it's certainly Trump, especially in his second time around.
I know that. I certainly know that. And it's great to have you. Joining me also is Lenny Benhamo from our business development team. Lenny works with companies large and small, helping them find the exact right client solution.
Hey, Naomi. Thanks so much for having me. I definitely agree with Thomas. Trump is always a fascinating topic, and especially when we're going to be exploring some of the changes in how businesses will have to handle a whole range of compliance issues under this new, somewhat wild card of an administration.
Yeah, I think we can all agree with that. Okay, let's buckle up for this ride. So, Thomas, will compliance change under a Trump presidency?
Well, as I have been saying and writing since 2016, the only predictability when it comes to Trump is really his unpredictability. But this administration does certainly have a focus on deregulation, which will likely mean less oversight in some areas. That said, topics such as international sanctions are issues that need to be unpacked separately, as these are a bit more complex. For instance, sanctions on Russia might get looser, but sanctions on Iran will likely ramp up. Businesses will thus have to stay nimble, as rules could shift overnight.
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. And in general, what do you think companies can do to prepare for that approach?
First of all, be agile. Make sure your systems can adapt quickly. Proactive planning is your best friend here, really. Anticipate changes and get your legal and compliance teams prepped for a, shall we say, dynamic environment.
That's really, really excellent advice. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of all of this. Thomas mentioned sanctions, so we'll start there. But before we do, we want to hear from all of you. And this is our first poll question. Are you more worried about a sanctions violation under the Trump administration? Yes, we're very worried. Yes, we are concerned. Possibly, not at all, or not sure. So as we get into the conversation about sanctions, we want to hear from you. Are you more worried about a sanctions violation under the Trump administration? Yes, we're very worried. Yes, we are concerned. Possibly, not at all, or not sure. We'll give everyone a couple of seconds to answer, and then we'll get her answered. Okay, so this is really, really interesting and not what I expected. 0% of you are very worried, which is not what I expected. Like I said, 32% are concerned, 32% possibly, 11% not at all worried, 26% not sure. So really interesting that none of you are very worried about this, which could be legitimate or not. Hard to know. Okay, so let's hear whether those responses are valid. Lenny, Trump does have a history of using sanctions as a foreign policy tool. Are we going to see some changes here?
Yeah, so I just want to say quickly about the results. It's good to see that no one's losing sleep over this, but that there is a healthy amount of concern, as there should be. And when there's that, then you can start to plan and move forward. To your question, Naomi.
Great point.
To your question, Trump loves shaking things up. So sanctions could get broader and stricter, but it's, of course, hard to say for sure. He did go all in on Iran and Venezuela. So it's likely that if he feels like a country isn't cooperating, he could hit them with sanctions. But the flip side is that he also uses sanctions as leverage in negotiations.
Interesting. Are we talking about like specific countries now?
Yeah, definitely expect to focus on China. And Trump is also expected to be much tougher on Iran due to their nuclear program and the ongoing war against Israel by Iran and their proxies. And Turkey is also trending closer towards being sanctioned by the US, as a lot is likely to depend on how Erdogan decides to respond to American priorities in the Middle East. And Erdogan has also threatened to attack Israel directly. And that kind of language is not likely to go down very well in Trump's Washington. And Russia also struggles to make progress in its invasion of Ukraine. So any further deference deals between Turkey and Russia could provide a trigger for this legislation to pass or for more specific sanctions to be implemented. And much will also depend on the post-Assad situation in Syria. If Turkey intensifies its military operations against Kurdish forces, particularly in areas where US troops are present, then that could also provoke swift action.
So there's a lot to keep an eye on there. What about specific industries like energy, defense?
Yeah, so industries like semiconductors, AI, or anything tied to critical infrastructure will see stricter controls. But even industries that don't seem directly involved might also get caught in the crossfire. especially with secondary sanctions, which is what is of interest to UK businesses. So those are the ones that punish businesses outside of the US for engaging with sanctioned entities. So if you're trading with a company linked to a sanctioned regime, then your business could suddenly find itself locked out of US markets. So for EU and UK businesses that rely on global supply chains, secondary sanctions targeting companies with ties to China or Iran could really be disruptive to their operations.
Kind of scary. Yes, kind of a scary thought there.
Yeah, it kind of is. Look, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, was very active during Trump's first term. And even if you're based outside the US, if you touch US markets in any way, then you're in OFAC's jurisdiction. And as we mentioned, there are secondary sanctions to consider. So if you're not doing so already, this is a really good time for businesses to evaluate and check their sanction screening processes. You want to make sure that you're vetting every customer, every supplier, every partner, and also not just check them once, because sanctions lists are constantly changing. So you want to have a tool that has ongoing monitoring and knows to automatically wave a red flag if something in the regulatory landscape changes and now one of your clients or partners or suppliers are at risk. So you could use something like OmniTrack or something else, but you want to make sure that the tools that you're integrating have sanctions lists from OFAC and EU and the UN. And then once you have your policies and processes in place, you always want training to complement that. You want to train your employees, because a misstep isn't just a slap on the wrist anymore, but it could mean millions in fines or even losing key market access.
So those are excellent points. And like you say, use OmniTrack or use something. But if anyone here is interested in OmniTrack, write OmniTrack in the chat if you want to hear more about OmniTrack. But it's a great point. You need to be using some automated tools to help with this process. And like we said, sanctions change so quickly. Businesses just need to be ready to pivot. Isn't that right, Thomas?
It certainly is. One day you're working fine alongside a partner, and the next the partner is tied to a sanctioned entity. And it's so easy for the government to go after a company that is in breach. For example, look at the case of Global Foundries that was fined $500,000 for shipments of semiconductor waivers to SJ Semiconductors, a company that was the Department of Commerce's BIS entity list without obtaining the necessary license. They didn't get the license because of a data entry error in the company's transaction screening system, which prevented proper screening of SJS. However, the error resulted in an accidental shipment of the legacy chips without a license and a big fine. The companies thus need pretty much heighten their vigilance, really, when navigating complex export regulations, especially amid US-China tech tensions.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, I couldn't agree more. And I just wanted to add something that I think is really interesting. There's been an increased global cooperation in sanctions enforcement, especially with recent international conflicts. So sanctions regimes are more synchronized among the US, the EU, and other global partners. And this synchronization has made sanctions more effective, but also more complex for businesses who are operating internationally. So businesses just need to understand the specifics of the regulations and how they interact across different jurisdictions, because each country has its own rules and enforcement methods in its sanctions programs. For instance, in the US and the UK, Canadian sanctions might apply differently to the same transaction based on ownership and the specific sanctions in place.
And that's really pretty complicated.
It could be. Yeah. Companies just have to understand their exposure to US sanctions and make sure that they have a strategy to handle any potential conflicts between the US and EU or UK regulations. And just to pile on a little bit more, penalties apply even for accidental breaches. So I would say Monitor your supply chains and subsidiaries very closely, especially if they involve China or Iran. And the danger of secondary sanctions, rather, targeting companies with China or Iran is real. So this could disrupt EU and UK businesses that do rely on global supply chains.
So it's really, really important, really, really important, like just important points. So, Thomas, will the Trump administration actually influence these policies in the UK and the EU?
Well, it will at least indirectly influence or affect the UK and EU rather, especially for multinational companies. For example, stricter US sanctions on Iran or China could force European companies with US ties to rethink their compliance framework. After all, even if the EU doesn't align with US policies, companies with operations in both regions will need to navigate the contradictions, such as the secondary sanctions we've already alluded to, or differing the enforcement priorities. So, and I'm not trying to sound like a broken record, but companies really do need to get ready.
I get it. And clearly they really do. And I think let's get another poll question in here because we want to hear from everybody. How is your company preparing for the impact of a Trump administration's likely stricter sanctions? Really, the question is, what's your top priority in preparing? Are you reassessing your sanctions policies? Are you training your team? Are you working with suppliers to ensure they're compliant? Are you exploring changing suppliers to avoid issues? Are you just not doing anything? Like, what's your top priority in preparing for the impact of these very, very likely stricter sanctions? Are you reassessing your sanctions policies, training your team, working with suppliers to ensure they're compliant, exploring changing suppliers to avoid issues, or just not doing anything? Really tell us what's your top priority here. Give a few more seconds. And let's see here. Okay, really interesting. 19% of you are reassessing your sanctions policies. Wow. Only 6% of you are training your team, and it's something we keep saying is so important. 19% of you are working with your suppliers to ensure they're compliant. 13% of you are exploring changing suppliers to avoid issues. Nearly half of you are just not doing anything. So feel free, pop some comments in the chat. Why are you doing this? Why is that your top priority? Why are so many of you not doing anything? We want to hear about that. Do you really not think that there's going to be likely stricter sanctions? So let us know in the chat. You can also download our comprehensive guide to sanctions compliance, which is coming up in the chat now. It's an extremely, extremely, extremely comprehensive guide. So that's coming up in the chat right now. You can download it. Okay, let's move on to what could become trade wars. If tariffs with Europe spike, compliance team could be in for a huge headache. Isn't that right, Thomas?
Yes, but whether or not Trump does impose tariffs on Europe depends on various factors. There are his administration's trade policies and the ongoing negotiations with the EU, just to name two. But if we look historically, then Trump has certainly never shied away from using tariffs as leverage in trade disputes, famously calling tariffs the most beautiful word. And during his first term, he wasn't shy when it came to imposing these on European goods, such as steel, aluminium, and certain agriculture products. So if tariffs are reinstated or expanded, the implications for compliance could certainly be significant.
So what do you think are those implications?
Well, to start with, compliance teams will need to nail down the right codes to see if tariffs apply to their products. And mistake here mean fines or customs delays, which no business wants. But it's not just paperwork and taxes, really. Tariffs might also lead the EU to impose retaliatory measures like quotas or even bans on certain goods. If such a scenario were to occur, compliance teams would need to worry about rules on, frankly, both sides of the ocean. And by the way, UK companies are particularly vulnerable in this scenario because post-Brexit, as we all know, they need strong trade ties to both the US and EU. Moreover, supply chain would get tangled up in this. Companies might have to reconsider their sourcing and production, perhaps shifting operations to non-EU countries to avoid tariffs. And then compliance teams will need to vet new suppliers and partners to make sure they're not at risk.
And then there's the issue, of course, to make things more complicated, that tariffs could overlap with sanctions.
Precisely. If a tariff targets goods from regions linked to sanctions, like an EU business with connection to China or Russia, then the compliance teams will need to juggle tariffs and sanctions together. All this ought to serve, quite frankly, as a wake-up call to rethink supply chain and tighten compliance systems.
Well, wake-up call indeed. Lenny, can businesses prepare for something like this?
Yeah, of course. You can prepare for anything. The first step would be obviously to stay informed about these tariff announcements and any trade negotiations between the US and the EU. Make sure that there's collaboration now in your company between the compliance team, the legal team, the supply chain teams, and make sure that you have contingency plans in place. Things like alternative sourcing, so that you can mitigate some of the potential impacts of tariffs. And along that, again, you want to make sure to train your staff so they'll be compliant with any new regulations and reporting requirements. And this could require dynamic training, which is training that evolves with you as the regulatory landscape evolves as well. So the landscape is not static, nor should your training be, or your policies or processes. And finally, in all of that, it's most important to just communicate. Be in touch with suppliers, customers, and regulators so that you can address all of these challenges before they become bigger problems.
Excellent advice. Thank you. Let's move on now to what is possibly the most controversial element of a new Trump administration, which is, of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or DEI. Thomas, do you think the new administration will scale back support for DEI programs? Or do you know they will?
I think we know by now it's a virtual certainty. It took him basically 2 days to essentially obliterate DEI efforts with a scathing executive order that cuts DEI policies in the federal government, as he is set to fire all DEI roles by today. And let's not forget, in 2020, so the man has a history of this, Trump had already signed an executive order targeting race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating, where he laid the groundwork for widespread attacks on diversity efforts in public institutions. Joe Biden rescinded this order and issued his own, which ever since yesterday has been reversed. So in essence, the culture wars are here to stay, I'm afraid. That said, many companies will keep investing in these programs nonetheless to meet the expectations of employers, consumers, and investors, at least for now.
Wow. And how will this recent decision by the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals to strike down NASDAQ's board diversity rules impact all of that? Because it could be that companies will want to preserve these programs, but then there's this rule that's striking it down.
Yeah, that's a great question. For listeners who are not familiar with this recent case, NASDAQ, the tech-focused stock exchange, had implemented several ESG-focused rules on diversity and inclusion at board level. One rule required NASDAQ-listed companies to disclose data on the gender and racial makeup of their boards. The other rule required companies to work towards minimum targets for diversity of board members. These targets only required a company to have at least one female director and at least one director from an ethnic minority or who identified as LGBTQ. NASDAQ defended the rules, arguing they standardized disclosure and aligned with investor interests, citing studies linking board diversity to improve financial performance. But the court sided with two conservative groups who argued that the rules constituted unlawful quotas, with one of the judges even stating that the SEC had intruded into areas beyond its jurisdiction by approving NASDAQ's request. So the court's decision clearly reflects the broader political and legal backlash against woke corporate policies, such as ESG initiatives and affirmative action. I would say the ruling effectively strikes a blow on how companies manage their own regulations on DEI initiatives.
Wow. Wow, it's so crazy. Like just a few years ago, ESG was a major focus for listed companies. So, kind of what happened?
That's certainly true. It really represents a backlash, I suppose, against the once vaunted ESG. Money managers were promoting ESG funds that attracted billions in investment. BlackRock, we've all heard of, the world's largest asset manager, pledged to leverage its influence to push corporate boards toward climate-friendly policies. But you ask what happened. At the end of the day, it almost always comes down, at least partly, to money. And in recent years, the ESG movement faced real challenges because ESG funds struggled to outperform the broader market and demonstrate tangible environmental benefits. So investors withdrew approximately $13 billion from publicly traded ESG funds last year, according to Morningstar. Compare that to private renewable energy and broader energy sector investment funds, where investors contributed about $75 billion during the same period. Over the past 5 years, these funds have raised nearly $500 billion, far surpassing the capital raised for traditional fossil fuel investments. These numbers and a wider conservative backlash prompted BlackRock and other investors to scale back their ESG initiatives, while investors' interest in ESG funds have dwindled. And then, at the same time, legal challenges to policies addressing racial preferences gained momentum, culminating in a landmark Supreme Court decision last year that invalidated affirmative action in university admissions. The college admission case were brought by Students for Fair Admission, a group started by the anti-DEI activist Edward Bloom, who is the same person who also financed the successful challenge to the NASDAQ rules.
Wow, it's really, really interesting. And what does this mean? Does this mean an end to the DEI efforts?
I don't think we're quite there yet. Most of the largest US companies continue to champion DEI. Very few are completely abandoning it for now. In fact, in a recent analysis by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, indicated that 486 out of the Fortune 500 companies are, as of now, still publicly affirming their dedication to DEI initiatives. But there is no doubt at the same time that the court's NASDAQ ruling and the new political climate under Trump will have a significant impact for corporate board diversity. Companies should certainly be hesitant about making instant changes to their DEI programs or just ceasing them altogether. Instead, it is important to think strategically about diversity policies and focus on the return on investment which DEI brings to business.
A really good point, and it's something to really think about. And Lenny, how will this all impact UK and EU companies?
It will have an impact quickly. I agree with Thomas completely that there's a lot of noise about a hard stop to a lot of this, but it needs to be taken with a grain of salt because it just does. There's always more underneath. To your question, affecting UK and EU businesses, it might not directly influence UK and EU laws, but like Thomas talked about, the cultural shift that could embolden anti-DEI voices, not just in the UK and the EU, but globally. So it's really interesting because the EU and increasingly the UK actually are moving in the opposite direction. The EU Green Deal and Expanded Equality Act in the UK will likely keep ESG and DEI initiatives at the forefront. And for companies who are in the UK and EU, stakeholder expectations there are still high. So basically, even if US federal incentives are reduced, UK and EU companies should continue investing in the end of the day in their ESG and DEI initiatives.
It's really true. The Labour government expanded the Equality Act, and that's kind of moving us in the UK in the opposite direction.
Yes, it is. And if you haven't already, as we step into 2025, I would say that the time is now for compliance teams and DEI teams around to invest in tech. Things like compliance monitoring and DEI impact measurement tools can be real game changers. And as I mentioned before, also training, don't forget training, make sure that everybody from your C-suite all the way to your entry-level employees know how to navigate all of these issues. And I would just say the bottom line is don't lose sight of your values as a company. That way, no matter what, you're always in a good place.
Great point. And if anyone's interested in any of our diversity and inclusion courses, write DEI in the chat right now and someone will be in touch. So I'm really curious to hear the answers to the next poll. Are you changing your approach to DEI in light of the new political climate in the US? So are you on this webinar changing your approach to DEI in light of the new political climate in the US? So yes, we are scaling back significantly. We are scaling back slightly. You're making no changes. We're investing a little more. We're investing a lot more, or you're not sure. So again, the question is, are you changing your approach to DEI in light of the new political climate in the US? And there's clearly a new political climate in the US. You're scaling back significantly. You're scaling back slightly. No change. Investing a little more, investing a lot more, or you're not sure. Give everyone a couple more seconds to answer. Wow, really interesting. 4% of you are scaling back significantly. 4% are scaling back slightly, so pretty consistent. 61% of you are making no change, which is very interesting. 4% are investing a little more. 4% are investing a lot more. 22% of you are not sure. So the overwhelming majority of you are not making any change. And I don't know, Thomas or Lenny, did you expect that most of the companies, at least on this webinar, are not making any change? They're not reacting to this, at least not yet.
I guess it just indicates that people are kind of in a wait and see kind of mode, which is pretty much in alignment with all things Trump, because we've mentioned already he's pragmatic, unpredictable, a bit of a wild card. It's day 2. There have already been, as Thomas mentioned, significant developments in Washington. So I guess we're just in wait and see mode, really.
Yeah, it's a good point. Very fair point. Okay, let's move on to national security issues, which will also likely see a shift under the new administration. Thomas, which industries could face less or more enforcement pressure under the new administration?
Well, it's anticipated that industries like energy and healthcare are going to get a bit of a break. There is going to be a focus on cutting a lot of red tape, and this might ease the regulatory burden for these industries. But as we alluded to, compliance around national security issues, such as sanctions, but also AML and cybersecurity, will still be under a microscope. AML compliance is likely to be a top priority, in fact, with organized crime and terrorism financing keeping the pressure on financial institutions to meet the reporting requirements such as CDD and the SARs. Basically, some areas will see less oversight, but national security and geopolitical priorities will ramp up enforcement in others. Compliance teams should thus gear up for more scrutiny in these areas. Update your risk assessments, refresh training programs, and certainly monitor your supply chain and subsidiaries closely, especially, as we said, if they involve China or Iran.
Yeah, no, very, very good advice. And speaking of AML, what's going to happen with cryptocurrencies under this administration? I know Trump is a big fan, but we all know that digital currencies make money laundering scams so easy to do. Lenny, what do you think?
Yeah, that's right. It does make it easy. And unfortunately, that's not going to matter much. And the crypto bros around the world are rejoicing. There will likely be a very pro-crypto stance in this administration, which could lead to more lenient regulatory environment for digital assets. And Trump even launched his own cryptocurrency, and so did Melania. So that will be interesting to follow. And of course, a less regulated crypto sector could bring increased risks of fraud and money laundering, which means that financial institutions will need strong AML programs now more than ever, really.
Okay, so what do financial institutions in the UK and the EU need to think about now?
Basically, even if there's a lighter regulatory touch in the US, UK and EU financial institutions are still going to face pretty stringent local requirements. But they should still monitor US developments, especially around these crypto regulations. And it's important also for financial service institutions to be aware that the UK and EU might adopt different stances on sanctions on countries like Iran. If that's the case, they'll just have to figure out how to juggle these competing demands, these competing compliance demands, to be more exact.
Well, it's a lot. And even with Trump's pro-crypto position, he's likely to push for more sanctions on Middle East countries due to terrorism and terror financing. And it's been fairly well established that cryptocurrencies have been a financial stream for terrorist organizations. Isn't that right, Thomas?
Yeah, most certainly. Terrorist organizations have increasingly leveraged crypto to raise funds through crowdfunding campaigns, fake charities, and appeals on social media or encrypted platforms. And these methods often attract sympathizers worldwide under the guise of humanitarian or religious causes. Cryptocurrencies are, let's say it, perfect for these groups because they can do cross-border transfers without using traditional financial systems, theoretically letting them bypass sanctions and government scrutiny. And forget about tracing the true identities of the parties involved with crypto. Terrorists will also use things like mixers or tumblers to blend transactions from multiple sources, which makes it obviously even harder to track the origins and destinations of funds. Groups like Hamas and ISIS, for example, are known to use cryptocurrencies for global fundraising campaigns and for transferring the money. Hamas, again, has received over 7.3 million worth of crypto by July 2021, holding funds in Bitcoin, Tether, stablecoin, Ether, Dogecoin, and other crypto assets.
Wow, it's so important to be aware of this. The stakes are so high now. And coming up in our chat now is a link to our incredibly comprehensive guide, The State of Cryptocurrency Compliance in 2025. And this guide covers all the risks, the challenges, and what you can do basically to stay out of trouble this year. Okay, and Thomas, where is the Financial Action Task Force in all of this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The FATF introduced a travel rule which requires cryptocurrency exchanges to collect and share information about the parties involved in transactions. Governments and regulatory bodies are now starting to apply this. Advanced blockchain analytic tools are also starting to be deployed to trace suspicious activities, and international collaboration is now being used to tackle cross-border abuses.
Wow, it just all seems really significant, especially after the October 7th attacks in Israel.
Very true, yes. The Hamas investment office held assets of more than $500 million, including companies operating across North Africa and the Middle East. And it's important to note that since October 7th, there have been several rounds of coordinated sanctions on Hamas leaders, alongside new sanctions on Iran, to hold them to account for their support of Hamas. The Trump administration has already indicated a strong stance against Hamas and its activities. In December, for instance, Trump issued a warning to Hamas regarding the release of the hostages the terrorists took on October 7th, stating that failure to comply by his inauguration just a few days ago would result in severe consequences. And ultimately, the warning bore fruit when on January 19th, the 3 Israeli hostages were released by Hamas. More releases are supposed to follow, but it remains to be seen how it will all play out, quite frankly. That said, it is likely that that Trump's administration may consider implementing further measures, including additional sanctions to counteract their activities. Look at the executive order Trump signed during his first day to designate cartels as terrorist organizations. This, by the way, could embolden the DOJ to go aggressively after designated non-financial business and professions, or DNFBPs, who haven't undertaken proper due diligence to ensure that they aren't connected to criminal or terrorist financing. What's critical here for companies is to work with global compliance teams, so to synchronize your policies where possible and address conflicting regulations as quickly as you can.
Really important advice. And while we're on this topic, Lenny, what's the outlook for the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act under this administration? I know Trump is not a big fan of it.
No, he's not a big fan. He's very critical of the FCPA. And in fact, I think he called it a horrible law. So I would say that that's pretty critical. And we could definitely see a less aggressive approach to bribery cases. But remember that the DOJ and SEC do operate with some independence. And high-profile cases still grab headlines. So don't get too complacent.
It's rather. True.
You want to be compliant, but not complacent.
Fair point. Be compliant, don't be complacent. And it's really a good point, because look at the reaction to the Supreme Court Snyder decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. So for listeners who are not familiar with that case, the Snyder decision actually limited the federal prosecutor's ability to charge state and local officials for accepting illegal gratuities. Now, these payments were rewards or tokens of appreciation after official actions and are now excluded from federal anti-corruption laws. And the ruling overturned the conviction of a former Indiana mayor who accepted $13,000 from a contractor after awarding him a $1.1 million city contract, citing a lack of explicit legislative language covering gratuities. So the reaction from Congress was really interesting, and a word we don't hear a lot. A bipartisan group from the House introduced the No Gratuities for Governing Act of 2024. Now, this proposed legislation will strengthen anti-corruption laws. So it's almost like the Supreme Court's decision is giving Congress a real opportunity to demonstrate its stance against illegal gratuities. And advocates for this are really urging a quick approval to make sure that there's still accountability and to ultimately safeguard public integrity.
Okay, so that really does demonstrate that companies cannot get too complacent. Compliant, but not complacent. Isn't that true, Thomas? What do you think?
Exactly, yes. Also, even if Trump's criticism of the FCPA does mean fewer enforcement actions from the US on cross-border bribery cases, the UK companies still have to contend with the serious fraud office in the UK and EU regulators like Olaf. And right now, they're not really scaling back. In fact, if anything, European authorities may see this as an opportunity to take the lead on anti-corruption enforcement, especially in high-profile cases involving multinational companies.
So it really sounds like companies need to still make sure their anti-bribery policies are really robust and that their teams are trained to handle these cross-border investigations. So let's hear from everyone here. Another poll: how confident are you in your company's anti-corruption policies? Do you think you have a very effective program, a pretty good program? Your anti-corruption program needs to be updated. You don't have an anti-corruption program. I hope that's not true. Or you're not sure. So how confident are you in your company's anti-corruption policies? Do you think you have a very effective program, a pretty good program? Your anti-corruption program needs to be updated, or you don't have an anti-corruption program, or you're just not sure? Give everyone a couple more seconds to answer. How confident are you in your company's anti-corruption policies? So 27% of you feel you have a very effective program. Another 27% have a pretty good program. So that's almost half of you feel pretty good about your anti-corruption policies, which is good. 18% of you feel that your anti-corruption program needs to be updated. None of you say you don't have an anti-corruption program, which is actually very positive. and 27% of you are not sure about your company's anti-corruption policies. So these are really, really interesting results. And I think an important element here is really understanding what the regulations are. And just to let everyone here know, we have a number of comprehensive courses on the FCPA, if anyone is interested. And write FCPA right now in the chat or anytime during the webinar, and someone will be in touch with you about those courses. Now, I know that it gets a little complicated in the US with the federal laws versus the state level regulations. For instance, California has really strict data privacy laws, while other states are more lax. Now, Lenny, how is that going to play out here?
It's definitely something of a wild card. So if federal oversight scales back, then states might step in with their own regulations, which could create kind of a patchwork of rules, let's say, especially for companies from the UK doing business in different states. So it's going to be really important to stay informed about both the federal and state level changes and make sure that your company is equipped to handle both in different jurisdictions.
And I would imagine that's especially true when it comes to US data privacy laws, because they're all over the map, literally across the US. Like we said, California is very strict, but it seems like some states are starting to catch up with a slew of data privacy laws that were enacted this year in different states.
That's right. It is all over the map, literally and figuratively. Just in this past year, actually, 10 new state level consumer privacy laws were either enacted or took effect in the US, which expanded the already complex landscape of privacy regulation. And these laws generally protect state residents acting in personal capacities and exclude employees or business contexts. But of course, California continues to lead as the only state who extends protections to employees and to business data. But the most states maintain the established framework of distinguishing controllers or entities deciding how data is used from processors or entities handling data on behalf of controllers. So the definitions of personal data and exemptions for publicly available data do remain pretty consistent, but variations do exist. Another example, Oregon includes now household linked device data, and several states introduced some new consumer rights and expanded definitions of sensitive personal information. So the variation continues. Oregon and Maryland broadened the scope of biometric data, while California and Colorado added neural and biological data to their sensitive personal information definitions. And New Jersey included financial data in that, joining California as an outlier. Maryland's approach stands out for its stringent restrictions prohibiting the collection, processing, or sharing of sensitive personal information unless strictly necessary for requested services, which is in contrast with the opt-in consent model, which is adopted by other states.
So it's really a lot to keep track of.
Yes.
And so let's hear from everyone here. How confident are you, after hearing this is how complicated it is in the States, how confident are you in your company's data privacy policies? Do you feel your policies are effective? They're pretty good? Your data privacy policies possibly need to be updated? You don't have any data privacy policies, or you're not sure? So how confident are you in your company's data privacy policies? They're effective, they're pretty good, they need to be updated, you don't have any, or you're not sure. Give everyone a couple more seconds to answer. How confident are you in your company's data privacy policies? So 37% of you say that your policies are effective, and 2% of you feel your policies are pretty good, which is really more than half, and that's a very positive response. 11% of you feel their policies need to be updated. None of you say that you don't have any data privacy policies, which I think really reflects what's going on in the world right now with data and the importance of data privacy. And 11% of you are not sure. So that's really, really interesting. Just to let everyone here know, We have a very, very interesting course on US data privacy laws. And if you're interested in learning more about it, write data in the chat right now, and someone will be in touch. It's a course on US data privacy laws. And as you can see, it's pretty complicated all over the US map, but the course really breaks it down and makes it very clear. It's a comprehensive course. Write data in the chat now if you're interested. Okay, now we're moving into AI regulation. Not surprisingly, California is leading the way here. What AI regulation is coming out of Sacramento, Thomas?
Quite a lot, actually. Last year, the California Senate approved legislation called the California AI Accountability Act, which requires state agencies to notify users when they are interacting with AI, which makes sense. Also, the private sector would have to adhere to various rights, safeguards, and evolving best practices. At the same time, the act encourages the state to invest in AI education and to build AI competency in the state's workforce. It's very important to point out when we talk about this that this is just 1 out of 7 AI-related bills in the California legislature. And some of these would target algorithmic discrimination, meaning developers would have to perform an annual impact assessment, which describes the intended benefits and potential adverse impacts of their tools. Then there is also another important one, the Safe and Secure Innovation for Frontier Artificial Intelligence Act, designed to implement clear standards for the largest and most powerful AI models. Some bills would require watermarks on AI content or require developers to publish high-level summaries of their data sets.
Wow. And I heard that EU officials traveled from Brussels to California actually to discuss AI regulation. What's that about, and why is that important to us?
So yes, the EU actually opened an office in San Francisco in 2022 and dispatched a tech envoy to communicate about laws and regulations about AI. In general, you could say that California and the EU's AI Act both take a risk-based approach to regulation. Both advise continued testing and assessment of forms of AI deemed high risk, and both call for watermarking generative AI outputs. There are some differences between the EU law and what California lawmakers are considering, though. For instance, while the EU's AI Act addresses how law enforcement agencies can use AI, and we have not seen that with the upcoming California legislation yet. With all the California bills put together, excuse me, EU officials have said they are probably at around 70 to 80% of what the EU AI Act covers. But I think the main takeaway is that EU and California officials are working together to collaborate on AI regulation, which should at least bring, I suppose, some clarity to rules that businesses have to follow.
So all in all, it's a pretty serious approach to regulating AI. But Lenny, now that Elon Musk is taking a position in the US government, are we going to see a shift? Will Musk push the federal government to take a more lax approach to data protection?
It's an interesting question. It's hard to know yet what Elon Musk's influence on federal data protection policies will be, but it will likely depend on a number of factors, primarily, I believe, including how those policies will align with his vision for innovation and efficiency. Musk is known to believe that overregulation stifles progress, and stricter data protection rules could be seen in that case as hurdles to technological advancement. So he might advocate for a more relaxed approach, but he's also spoken about the need for thoughtful regulation, specifically in areas like AI safety. So if he pushes for more lax data rules, he could also risk some public backlash, but he never really seems to mind that. So that might not be a factor. We don't know. He will most likely want to ensure, though, that innovation thrives while also maintaining the need for some level of data protection to maintain public trust and also to meet international standards. But then the question is, will California and other blue states bring the same or even stronger AI and data protection rules? And that remains to be seen.
I'm going to get to another question, but I just wanted to tell everyone who's on this webinar, I know we're at our hour, and there's just so much to cover here. Whoever needs to jump off, obviously free to jump off. You'll be getting a recording. We're covering a few more issues. We're close to the end, but there are a few more issues. So just wanted to let everyone know, we know we're getting up to the hour. There's just so much to discuss here, and you will be getting a recording of the entire webinar after the webinar. And so, Thomas, I have another question, and thank you, Lenny, for those points. I have another question that businesses here are going to want answered, and that's the impact the new administration will have on importers, especially those that rely on imports from China. Trump nominated, I think he was approved, right? Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, and he has staked a strong position specifically on China's trade practices, including alleged forced labor. Thomas, does this signal a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy and trade enforcement?
So at this point, it's hard to say if there will be a significant shift, but it's true that Rubio, who is a well-known China hawk, has gained bipartisan recognition for his tough approach on China and has been very vocal opposition, quite frankly, to Chinese trade practices and alleged human rights violations. Rubio has also consistently advocated for aggressive measures against Chinese trade abuses, including forced labor allegations. He was a lead sponsor of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and he spearheaded efforts to prohibit imports from China's Xinjiang region unless businesses, which makes sense, can prove their supply chains are free from forced labor. This legislation then forced many companies to more closely examine their supply chain and sourcing practices. Rubio's approach reflects a growing cross-party consensus, to be fair, for a stricter trade environment in the US. His past efforts to tighten the de minimis exemption, which is a provision allowing low-value shipments to enter the US without tariffs or extensive inspections, I guess underscores his commitment to closing loopholes that potentially enable forced labor-tainted goods to enter the US market.
So, Rubio, as we said, was confirmed. What does it mean for businesses that rely on Chinese imports?
It means that there will likely be more enforcement of trade laws and increased pressure on companies to ensure ethical supply chains. Businesses reliant on Chinese imports may face stricter regulations and more scrutiny. I think that's fair to say. Rubio won't be the top decision maker on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Homeland Security managed that. But the State Department does form part of an interagency task force on forced labor. The department also has a history of trying to influence allies such as the EU, the UK, to match the US efforts. And it's not just Rubio who has a hawkish stance towards China. Others in Trump's cabinet hold similar positions. And in the UK and EU, there are increasingly tighter regulations aimed at fighting forced labor. All this, once again, is a wake-up call for businesses to take proactive measures to mitigate risk and ensure compliance wherever they're located.
Great point. And let's just get to our final question for each of you. What would each of you say is the top compliance priority now for UK and EU businesses? Thomas, we'll start with you.
I would say companies need to be more proactive, monitor US policy shifts closely and anticipate how they might affect your operations. And update your risk assessment now and make sure your monitoring systems are robust. Do not wait.
Great.
I completely agree. Don't wait. The regulatory landscape might be shifting with the Trump administration, but the risks aren't going anywhere. And as we talk about all of the changes that might come in and the shifts might occur, we definitely want to prepare for the unexpected. But I would also add, don't lose sight of your compliance fundamentals. AML, sanctions, ESG, anti-bribery. The landscape may shift, but these are always going to be significant to your compliance program, and make sure that whatever you have is dynamic and ready to evolve with you.
Great point. Great points, both of you. This was excellent information. I think we could just be here all day, but we have to cut it off at some point. So maybe we'll do a second one as we see what actually comes about with the Trump administration, and wanted to emphasize that it makes such a difference when we're ready for what's coming our way for all businesses. So that's all from us today. Remember, you can listen to this again and other programs from us on your favorite podcast provider. You will be getting a recording of the webinar shortly. Please be in touch if you want any more information from us about how VinciWorks can help